The amazing osprey ranks among the most unique and graceful of all birds. Osprey are distinctive, skilled hunters, as well as impressive migrants who travel thousands of miles per year. Ospreys are found on almost every continent, and they are the focus of this live Q&A. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And welcome to Bird Week on Explore.org, a celebration of birds and an opportunity to learn more about their amazing lives, abilities. During Bird Week, we'll be featuring the diversity of our feathered neighbors on our webcams, and we'll have several live events in the works. Yesterday, we talked about California condors, and right now we're talking osprey. And to help us learn more about them, I'm joined by Dr. Rob Bierregaard, an ornithologist and osprey researcher who's been working to study ospreys since 1971, he just told me. So Rob, thanks so much for being here and taking that to share your expertise with everyone.
You're welcome, Mike. Happy to do it. Always happy to do about ospreys.
Yeah, they're such fascinating birds, and I'm really eager to pick your brain about these animals because you've been studying them for such a long time. Like I just mentioned, you've been tracking osprey since 1971, and I've been reading a little bit of your published research, and you've made some pretty remarkable insights into the bird's migration, biology, and behavior. And of course, I have questions for Rob, but if you have questions, you're watching at home or on your mobile device, wherever you happen to be, if you want to learn more about ospreys, drop those questions in the comments right now, no matter where you're watching, whether that's on Explore.org or Reddit or Facebook or TikTok. And we'll try to answer as many of those questions during the broadcast as we can. And for some extra motivation, during this Q&A, we're also looking to give away some Explore.org Bird Week swag. So we'll give a prize to one viewer who asks a question about ospreys from each of our platforms where this broadcast is streaming right now. And I'll announce the winners at the end of the Q&A. We're also giving out prizes on all of our social media channels this week. So our handle for in those places is ExploreORG. There's no dot in there, just ExploreORG if you're looking for us on Twitter or Instagram, for example. And Rob, while we're waiting for questions to come in, and I know there's already a few coming up in the queue here, but the one that I wanted to ask you right away was about sort of like your journey to researching birds. How did you first become interested in birds, and how did you get your start studying them?
Blame it on my high school biology teacher. It's all his fault. I went to a prep school about 9 miles north of New York City that has a zoo that was founded by that biology teacher, Frank Trevor, 30 years before I got there. And students, one of our community service options, students did something to help the school, and one of the things that you could do was work at the zoo. So I was always interested in animals. I was always going to be a biologist. And so when the opportunity came in to work at the zoo, I took that opportunity, and that's where I first got involved with birds of prey. The first birds I took care of was a barred owl, who of course I called Shakespeare, and a black vulture, and then I graduated up to taking care of Empress, a golden eagle, who every spring would build a nest with whoever was taking care of her. And so I would sit in this cage with the golden eagle, sit on the ground and hand her stick. She would take a stick from me and put it in the nest and look up at me and say, "Where's my next stick?" And I don't think I ever recovered from that. So, and then I happened to go up to Martha's Vineyard, where there were, in 1971, there were 2 pairs of ospreys nesting. This was at the nadir of the DDT-induced crash of ospreys in southern New England. There were 2 on the vineyard, and they were doing very well. They were fledging 3 or 4 young, because it turns out that Martha's Vineyard couldn't afford helicopters to spray DDT in the marshes, so this was a little a sanctuary for ospreys where they weren't having DDT. And after we realized that they were having the real problem there was nest sites, we started putting up poles, and I just got back from censusing the ospreys. The 25th year I've been running a census up there, and there are over 100 pairs nesting on Martha's Vineyard now.
Excellent. It's great to hear about their recovery in many parts of North America and other parts of the world. And I definitely want to get into that topic a little bit later on about, some of the threats that they've experienced in the past and threats that they might be experiencing today. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about was about their ability to migrate long distances, fly long distances. And that's one of the first questions that actually came up in our queue here. Sergeant Pepper on Explore.org was wondering about their ability to fly at night. How often do they fly at night? I associate ospreys with, daytime activities, hunting for fish during the day. But what are they doing at night?
If they're migrating over land, they won't fly over at night. Very rarely do they fly at night. Effectively, they don't fly at night. With their land, they'll fly for 8 to 10 hours a day and then settle down someplace at the late afternoon and spend the night and then take off again the next day if weather's right. However, some birds go over open water, and depending on when they leave and how much water they have to cross, they may have to fly at night because they can't land in the water and rest like a gull or a duck could. So almost all the East Coast ospreys and some of the Midwest ospreys migrate to South America, and that includes, at least for the East Coast birds, they have to fly across the Caribbean from Hispaniola down to South America, and that can be a 17-hour flight. So depending on when they leave, that usually entails some overnight flying. And young birds, ospreys that are born on the East Coast, on Martha's Vineyard, for instance, or one extreme example, I went up to Newfoundland in Canada, which sticks way out in the Atlantic. And I tagged young birds there because I thought that some of them would probably fly very long distances over the Atlantic. And that's, in fact, what happened. One of the young ospreys I tagged in St. John's in Newfoundland flew 2,200 miles or so over the water, 85 hours of nonstop flight. And that ties the record for overwater migration distance by a raptor. The co-record holder is the Amur falcon, some of which migrate from India to Eastern Africa, and their southbound migration.
Well, that's quite incredible that osprey have that ability to endure such long flights over the water, probably where they can't take advantage of rising thermal currents. I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong. Unlike like a hawk, if a hawk's flying along a mountain chain, it can use like the rising warming air during the day to sort of soar and carry it on the wind. But do osprey have that option when they're flying over the water, or is it solely just powered flight?
It's mostly powered flight, but there are very significant thermals over the Gulf Stream.
Okay.
So I didn't see that happening as best I could tell in my data, but there are thermals out there. They can do some sort of a dynamic soaring, similar to what albatrosses do, and I don't know how exactly that works. But a couple of tracks of birds I followed from crossing the Caribbean were doing this sort of loopy thing where they would climb up. It looked like they tacked into the wind and gained some elevation, and then turned and went downwind and picked up speed and banked back into the wind. So there were some set of circumstances where they were able to do that. But mostly it's just powered flight. And they'll certainly stop and rest. If they see a ship in the middle of their crossing, they will certainly stop and rest.
Well, yeah, you got to take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves. And for our North American birds, before I get to our next viewer question, so we're looking at a nest in Montana on the top of the view right now, and then a nest along the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland at the bottom view. For the North American ospreys, are they all going to South America in the wintertime? Is that their their final destination?
Probably 90% of the East Coast birds and close to that for the Midwest birds go to South America. A few short stop and some get to Florida and say that's far enough. Some winter in the Caribbean. Some go down through the Midwestern birds will, some of them go overland and they may stop in Central America, but most of the East Coast and Midwest birds go all the way into South America, and they go as far as south as Argentina. Some of them do. The Pacific birds from California on up north tend to stop either in Mexico or Central America. Very few of them make it all the way to South America.
And we do have a viewer question that's about migration as well. So this comes from the person whose handle is Owl and Osprey and writing on explore.org, who asked if ospreys act more communal during migration or if they kind of stay to themselves. And what do we know about that? Owl and Osprey is particularly interested in if they've reached, they pair up once they reach their migration destination, but I wonder if mated pairs meet up again, maybe during migration.
No, they don't. They fly solo, and sometimes you'll see groups of ospreys, but that's simply because they're following the same path, and Freddie Rodriguez in Cuba has seen lots of ospreys soaring together, but it's more simply that they're sort of thrown together because they're going down the same ridge, and they sort of get funneled into the same spot. But if they're so generally they're just migrating alone, and then they may run into other ospreys, but I don't think they seek out the presence of company of other ospreys and migrate as any sort of a cohesive group. They're going independently, and when they get down south, they're all on their own. The females typically leave the nest 3 or 4 weeks before the males and the young do. And so males and females of a pair go to different places. We've seen that with satellite data, and we really didn't even need the satellite data to know that, because females leaving in August, there's no way they're going to wind up in the same place as their mate who leaves in the first 2 weeks of September. So, and the young go independently. There's no family cohesion. The young just sort of wander off whenever the urge hits them, when the hormones levels that are driven by the shortening day length in the summer and early fall, some combination of hormones and they're being physiologically capable of flight because they've stocked up on enough fish. They just go off on their own, and then they come back from their separate, the adults come back from their separate migration spots and typically meet back up at the nests they've been using for years. If one doesn't come back, it gets replaced. And right now in the vineyard, where there's so many ospreys, that there are a lot of fights going on over who's going to take over at territories.
And of course, there are many different osprey populations, across North America, and we don't have any cams of osprey in Texas, for example, but Kimberly Spillman on TikTok was wondering about that. Are there many osprey in Texas? So what do we know about osprey in sort of like the mid-continent of North America?
Osprey, there are some nesting in Texas. In fact, there are ospreys either nesting or trying to nest in all of the lower 48 states, which is their ospreys are increasing almost everywhere. The only place ospreys aren't increasing is where bald eagle numbers are increasing. So ospreys and bald eagles, as most fans of osprey cams know, ospreys and bald eagles don't play nicely together. Bald eagles steal food from ospreys. They'll take young ospreys out of the nest. So they certainly put pressure on osprey populations. Maybe one of the reasons that ospreys pre-DDT were nesting in colonies, really, especially in southern New England. So some places where bald eagles now are recovering or continuing to recover from DDT. There are places where osprey numbers are going down, and that's because bald eagle numbers are going up. So ospreys, as they recovered from DDT, found themselves in what to them was a very happily a bald eagle free environment. So their numbers went way up, and now because they have a shorter generation span than bald eagles, their numbers increased more quickly. And now bald eagle numbers are sort of catching up. So I think in some areas where both bald eagles and ospreys nest, there's going to be they're going to come back to an equilibrium where we may see fewer ospreys. Now, it won't be a lot, but we'll see fewer ospreys than what we saw at the absolute peak before bald eagles started to move back in. But anyway, so they're nesting in all of the lower 48 states. They're between 10 and 12,000 pairs around Chesapeake Bay, according to Brian Watts, which is just remarkable. There's certainly more ospreys in North America now than there were before the DDT era, and that's probably by a lot.
Well, so that's great news to hear overall. And if you're just tuning in, we're talking ospreys with Dr. Rob Bierregaard, who's an ornithologist and osprey researcher. So if you have questions about osprey, about their biology or their behavior, drop those in the comments, and we have some moderators from explore.org sending those in my direction. Rob, you were just talking about how widespread this species is. They nest in every state in the lower 48. I know that they nest in Alaska as well. So I guess the only state they're not found in is Hawaii, but they're found in so many different places. They can be found in Africa, in Europe. And Sandra on Facebook was wondering sort of
having a little sex scene down in the Chesapeake Bay there. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you there. I didn't. I was reading the question. I didn't catch that. But yeah, this is the time of the year for like the courtship and copulation going on. So before we get to Sandra's question on Facebook, how does that work in osprey? So what's the courtship process for them like? And do they need to establish pair bonds every year when they meet up once again?
They do, and for when an experienced pair is coming back to the same nest that they see their mate, they re-encounter their mate from perhaps many years, that could be 10 or more years. The courtship is really fast. So when the males typically get back a little ahead of females, and if they're an experienced male, they'll go back to their regular nest. And they may have to fend off a couple of young whippersnappers who are trying to take over their nest. But typically in birds, the home court advantage is a real big thing. So if a bird comes in and that's his territory, he's not taking no for an answer from any young ospreys that are trying to take over his nest. So assuming he successfully reestablishes himself at his nest, he will go and start to catch fish and do what we call, here comes another copulation. It's a little too windy, I guess. He will go catch a fish, and then he'll do what we call sky dancing, where he'll go 300 feet or so above the nest, and he'll start to give this very loud, whistly cry. And then he'll do these big dives where he will go into a stoop and then pull out and go back up and hover, holding his fish in his talons, obviously telling any potential mate or showing any potential mate what a good fisher person he is. If his mate comes back, they'll quickly get, they don't have to introduce themselves. They know each other, and they can get right down to fixing up the nest and copulating and laying eggs. Sometimes if a male is doing his courtship display, sky dancing, and a young female comes in, he may begin courtship with her. But then if this regular female, his old partner from years past, returns, I always joke that he will deny ever having seen that other osprey. But typically the female will chase away any young females that were there, just the way the males do. So typically they get right back down to it, and they'll often they'll have to retrim the nest, and in some cases they'll have to rebuild the whole nest, which they do pretty quickly, and within very short order they can be on eggs. So I'm surprised that the Chesapeake Bay birds here are not on eggs, because I just got back from Martha's Vineyard, which is several hundred miles north of the Chesapeake Bay, and most of the pairs up there are already sitting on eggs. So I don't know if what's going on here.
Yeah, that bottom nest, actually there's an interesting thing that happened there. I think maybe just last week, they did have a pair of eggs there, but the female, for some reason, stopped like guarding them, and then a pair of crows came in, or at least one crow came in and ate the eggs. So maybe this is another attempt for them to re-nest. I guess that's the advantage of maybe living in a habitat where they are. They can perhaps try again if since the season is long enough in that Chesapeake area. But have you seen that before, where maybe a first nesting attempt is unsuccessful and then they'll try once again?
Yeah, we occasionally see really late pairs, which suggest that a clutch was lost on the first attempt. If the incubation period is 38 days, which is really long, it's about a week longer than you would expect for a bird the size of an osprey, and then there's an 8-week period between hatching and first flight. So when you add that together, that's over 3 months before the young are from egg laying to the young flying, and then the young need a couple or 3 weeks to learn how to teach themselves how to hunt. The adult ospreys do not teach their young to hunt. You see that all the time, either written or in comments. So the adults don't teach their young to hunt. They simply provide food for the young while the young go out and experiment on catching fish all their own. It's like mother duck doesn't teach a young duckling to swim. The duckling just gets in the water and does it, and that's what ospreys do with catching fish. Now, they won't be very good at it at first, but typically within a week to 10 days of trying to catch fish, young ospreys will have caught their first fish. They won't be good at it at first, and that's why they keep coming back to the nest, and where Dad will be providing an allowance really for them while they learn how to hunt. But anyway, so that whole process takes so long that if they're going to restart it, it's got to be after they spent a whole lot of time on one clutch of eggs before, and they have to have lost that clutch of eggs pretty early in the process, or there won't be time to get in another attempt.
Okay, and if you could give like a ballpark figure on that. Actually, Diana on Explorer was wondering what's the latest date eggs can be laid in Maine. So if you're thinking just in general about the northeastern United States, what might that time frame be for egg laying?
Well, certainly there are birds on Martha's Vineyard that haven't laid yet, but it is getting late. No, so if we back it up, because up in Newfoundland where they certainly get a late start up there. They leave in the middle of September to August. They could lay in June and still, so they could lay in June, but have to be early June.
All right. Well, if you're still, if you're watching your favorite osprey nest in the Northeast U.S. or maybe even southern Canada right now, and you're wondering, is it too late for them? There's still some time. And I did mention that there's a question from Sandra on Facebook, and I'm going to get to that one now, although a little bit delayed. Sandra was wondering what makes these birds of prey so adaptable. Why do they live in climates that vary so much? I mean, there's such a wide-ranging species, and that's in contrast to like a bald eagle, for example, which is fairly restricted, to North America, but osprey are found across many different continents.
Well, bald eagles are found only in North America, but bald eagles nest from Florida to Alaska, so they're as flexible as ospreys in terms of the climate they can live in. Now, what's peculiar about ospreys? Why is there only one species of osprey across all of the continents except Antarctica? And that's because there are other large fish-eating eagles that ecologically replace bald eagles when you go to Africa or to Europe, across Asia. Hard to figure. I don't think anyone has a good explanation for why ospreys have not diversified into more species. Perhaps because they're sort of the base of their distribution is in the relatively high northern latitudes across Europe, Asia, and North America, and they haven't. So when they migrate such long distances south, when they come back north, they're spreading out. They can spread out over a fairly large area, so you don't have the reproductive isolation of a group of one population that can diverge enough to become a separate species. We have different subspecies of ospreys. There's in North America, there are two. There's the regular osprey that we all know, and then there's one down in the Caribbean. And then there's one European osprey, and then there's an Australian subspecies. The Australians would like to make that a separate species, but I think the genetics tell us that it's really just the subspecies of the worldwide distributed species that we know.
All right, we'll see who in the future. I guess we'll see who wins the battle between the lumpers and the splitters, taxonomically at least, or who wants to have another separate osprey species on their life list. And kind of along those lines with birds, moving around in the continent. You were talking about how they spread out across wide areas, and maybe that doesn't allow them to form sort of like different species or subspecies, at least in North America. But we have a couple related questions, or similar questions, I should say, about, what about the young birds? Salgal on Explorer asked, do you know if chicks return to the area where they were born after they fledge? And another person on Explorer, DMC, Gofflin, asked or wrote, when a young osprey returns for the first time a couple years after its birth, is it hardwired to return to the area where it was born, or might it go to a totally different place?
Great question, and it's different, depends on what sex you are. So males tend to return very close to where they were born. It's rare for a male osprey to breed more than, let's say, 20 miles from where it was born, whereas females will wander. So this is nature's way of keeping the gene pool mixed up. And also an aside that rarely does an osprey come back to its very specific nest. So I satellite tagged a lot of young ospreys, and only, I think, one or two of them even visited their old nest. They go back to the general vicinity, and females can go quite a ways, wind up nesting quite a ways away from where they were born. There's some female ospreys that were banded in New England that wound up nesting in around the Great Lakes. In fact, I had a young osprey that I satellite tagged on Martha's Vineyard that on her first exploration, leaving Martha's Vineyard, made it all the way to Lake Superior. That's about 1,200 miles west. And she settled down there for a month or so before she headed south, and she didn't survive the first migration cycle, so we don't know where she would have, but my guess is she would have gone back to the Great Lakes area. I've had females that I banded on Martha's Vineyard who wound up breeding in Maine. So typically, and this is true of most animal species, is that one sex will, if they are migratory at all, one sex will tend to stay close to its nest, and the fancy term for that is philopatry. And so one sex typically stays close to where it was born, and the other sex disperses, and that just reduces the chance of inbreeding. So in most birds, it's the males are philopatric. They tend to go back too close to where they were born, and the females tend to wander.
Oh, that's interesting. And because in some species, it's the opposite. It's, males might be the ones who sort of disperse the genetics of the population far and wide, while the females might show more of a homebody, a sort of attitude. And if you're just joining us, now I'm talking with Dr. Rob Bierregaard about ospreys. He's been tracking and studying ospreys since the early 1970s. So if you have questions about ospreys, drop those in the comments, no matter where you happen to be watching, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. In fact, we're giving away some prizes to people who ask questions, and we're going to try to do that for everyone, or at least one person on every platform who's watching. And I don't think we've had any questions from Reddit yet. So if you're watching on Reddit right now and you want some Bird Week swag from Explorer, drop a question in there. I think you might have a good chance. Rob, we were talking about dispersal just a moment ago. And ospreys, they form new pairs, and a lot of juveniles are, when they become adults, they don't have any experience nesting or raising young of their own. So April Owl on Explore.org was wondering a little bit about that. What are the factors that affect the laying of eggs and producing young with new osprey couples? And she says in parentheses, or April Owl says in parentheses, we have been waiting for some new pairs to lay eggs.
Yeah, so it's a slow process. As I'm sure many or most of the people that have been watching osprey cams for a while know, the young ospreys, when they go south in their first fall migration, they stay down, they do a gap year down south. They don't come back the next spring. So they're actually, so they go down one fall, they don't come back the next spring, they come back the following spring. And when they do come back, they typically, they're like teenagers. They get up really late, and they start migrating late. They many times they don't get back to the breeding grounds until late May or even early June, when most of the adults are already settled in. There are some records of at least one pair that successfully raised young on their first migration north, which would have been in their third calendar year. So it's a bird born in 2019, doesn't come back in 2020, but it comes back in 2021. It's in its third calendar year. And sometimes those birds raise young, but it's very rare. Typically they get back late and they'll pair up, and they'll sort of throw some sticks together, and they're not very good at it at first. We typically call these birds house hunters. You'll see a pair that's wandering around. They may have paired up and they're looking for a spot to build a nest. Some of them get a little better. Maybe the second year they're better at it, and they actually get a nest together. But it may take us 2 or 3 years before they actually sort of have all the pieces in place, and in fact are able to find a territory. I know on Martha's Vineyard, there are lots of birds floating around, and there are birds that may not get their first opportunity to breed until they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old. So the bird one of the birds I studied, Belle, and I wrote a kid's book, Belle's Journey, about one of these birds, and the bird in the story is actually a composite of 4 different ospreys, but I tagged Belle in 2010, and Belle's radio kept working until 2017. Then the radio failed, and I know until 2017 Belle hadn't nested. And it also turns out that Belle is Beau. We got the sex wrong when we put the radio on that particular young osprey. So it wasn't until last year that someone found Belle with a nest and 3 young. So that was probably, 9 well, let's see, it was 8 years of trying before Belle actually pulled off nesting, which ospreys can nest into their 20s. That often happens.
And what's their lifespan like? In fact, we had a question on TikTok about that. How long do they live?
The record is there was a female in Scotland who lived for 27 years and raised fledged 50 young over her career, and went through 6 or 7 young males. So that's the way out at the end of the bell curve. It's not unusual to find ospreys, especially females, that are in their early 20s. I know I've banded or trapped 2 or 3 females that were that old. Typically, though, I would guess that most sort of mid-teens is probably let's say 10 to 15 years old would be when they're really at their peak of reproductive success. Hard to figure out what the average is because, like almost all wildlife, in the first year for ospreys, there's probably a 60 to 80% mortality rate in that first migration cycle. But once they get through that first migration cycle, then the mortality rate is 10 to 15%. So that figuring out that first year is the hard part. And then after that, they sort of have it on cruise control. They go back to the same place every winter. If they're of the, if it ain't broke, don't fix it school of migration locations. And if you found a good fishing spot last year, no reason not to go back to it again this year. And it's amazing how an osprey can find basically the same tree in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. I had several birds that we followed for several years who would hit South America 1 year in Colombia and the next year 500 miles east in Venezuela. And despite that, they would still wind up finding the same tree that they'd been perching in and hunting from every winter before that. So they have some amazing ability to use the Earth's geomagnetic fields to navigate that we do not understand. The young birds that we tracked flying over the Atlantic from Martha's Vineyard, who had never been out over the ocean before, did an amazing job of correcting for wind drift. We looked at the track that the birds were making over the Atlantic. So this is out over open water, no visual landmarks. And despite dramatically shifting winds, the birds were flying in these amazingly straight lines for 1,000 kilometers.
That is incredible, because I am a person who will readily admit that I do not have a sense of dead reckoning. I have been disoriented on foggy mountaintops often enough to know that is not the case for me. But other animals, they can do it somehow. So really kind of incredible abilities that they have. And Rob, we haven't talked too much about the food sources of osprey during our Q&A. Yet the osprey are kind of specialized for hunting fish, and Hannah on Hannah 22472 on TikTok was wondering how important is the texture of an osprey's feet to their survival.
Yes, ospreys are I always semi sort of tongue-in-cheek say that ospreys are either very specialized generalists or generalized specialists. By that I mean they only eat fish, but they don't really care what kind of fish they eat as long as they're the right size to make it worth catching, and not so big that they can't get it out of the water. Their feet are remarkably adapted for catching fish. They have the base of the pads on their feet have little spicules, so it's like they have rough sandpaper on the soles of their feet, which obviously helps them to hold on to slippery fish. They also have an interesting adaptation. They can take one of the outer toe. So like almost all birds of prey, ospreys have 3 toes facing forward and 1 toe facing back. And unlike most birds, ospreys can move the outer toe or swing it around so it's coming from the back. So they have 2 talons will catch a fish from one side and 2 catch it from the other side, which helps, of course, in holding on to slippery fish. And then their talons are really sharply curved. They're more decurved than any other raptor that I've handled. So they basically they're wearing a glove with rough sandpaper on the palm of the glove and fish hooks at the tips of the fingers. All of that is remarkably efficient at holding on to slippery fish.
They also seem to know how to carry a fish when they're flying through the air. You talk a little bit about sort of like the aerodynamics of that. If you're holding a big fish, you don't want to hold it against in a way that the wind is beating against it. So how do the osprey sort of orient the fish in their talons when they're flying to eat it?
So when they take a fish out of the water, typically they've got they're holding on to it sort of sideways, 1 foot toward the head of the fish and 1 foot toward the tail. When they come out of the water, the fish is, as you say, against the wind, across the wind. So it's sort of like dragging a sail. And as soon as they can, they'll manipulate their feet around so that they've got 1 foot near the head of the fish and then the other foot toward the tail. And that gets the fish aimed head first. And so that the hydrodynamic design of the fish that makes it efficiently go through the water becomes an aerodynamically efficient way to go through the air. And if you watch, it's amazing to watch an osprey who's in the process of switching the fish from crosswise to head first. You can see them sort of struggling to make headway, the osprey, that is. And as soon as they get the fish swung around and head first, then all of a sudden it's like they shoot forward because it's so much more efficient. And then a nasty bald eagle comes in and tries to steal the fish.
Yeah, that's a common, I guess, risk that they take when they're in an area that's shared by bald eagles itself. And we did have a question come in from Reddit. Lighting the Fire asks, what does the word osprey mean? Do we know what its origin is? Oh, and there's some copulation happening on the charlo nest.
Yeah, I forget. I knew that once, and I can't remember.
All right.
So I know that they're. I don't know the origin of that. The scientific name, Pandion haliaetus. Haliaetus means sea eagle, basically. And Pandion comes from Greek mythology, I think.
Yeah, so sometimes, scientific names have a very specific meaning to them. So those often tell stories about like the bird's biology or their discovery, or at least or description in science. So you can look those up and they can find and gather or glean some pretty interesting information about the animals just through that name. If you're joining us a little bit late and you're wondering what's going on, I'm talking with Dr. Rob Bierregaard about ospreys. So if you have any questions about ospreys, drop those in the comments, and we'll try to answer a few more of those before we conclude at the top of the hour. And Rob, I want to transition just a little bit here for this next question, because it's a little bit about osprey gossip. And because we've been watching the nest on the Chesapeake Bay, and that's the cam that we're looking at on the bottom, and we saw that the female, who's nicknamed Audrey, she failed to incubate the eggs, and Stonebreaker 57 on Explored.org was wondering about that. Do you have an idea of why the female would stop incubating the eggs and eventually abandon them?
No, that's. I don't know that this nest, this Chesapeake nest a few years ago, the female took off and she was off the eggs for something almost 10 hours. And it was a rainy day. It was maybe in the 50s. And I figured and nobody, we don't know what happened. But the most amazing part of that story is that when she got back to incubating the eggs, the eggs hatched and they fledged those young. I would have bet a lot of money that those eggs wouldn't have survived that process, that long a period of being exposed to a cold, windy, rainy day on the Chesapeake, and nonetheless they survived. So what made her take off and abandon the eggs for that long, I have no idea.
Yeah, with these individual animals, it's so difficult sometimes to get into their mindset, and often we just can't formulate sort of a motivation or reason for what they're doing. And in fact, this next question is kind of along those lines, Rob. So sorry for putting you on the spot with this, but Meadow on Explore.org writes about a nest called Hellgate, and I'm not familiar with that nest location, but Meadow writes, how common is it for male osprey to try to raise two nests? That seems to be the situation that happened in this area that Meadow's writing about. Have you heard about that before? Yeah,
it's rare, but it happens. The Allen Pool at the Westport River, where he has a fairly dense colony, you can stand in one spot at the mouth of the Westport River and count 30 different osprey nests without moving your feet. He's had males that will take care of a second female, and so it does happen. The beta female often doesn't get enough fish to raise young, or many young anyway. And we've also had cases where we've had two males at one nest. And there was a nest I knew of in South Carolina where two males fed the female, and they would both go off if turkey vulture was coming down the river. Both male ospreys would go off and attack it and drive it away. So sometimes we have one male taking care of two females, and sometimes we have two males taking care of one female. But those are very rare. It's 1 in 100 or less do we see that. And there are a lot of times where it can't happen because nests are pretty far apart. But when you're in a colonial situation like they have at the mouth of the Westport River, it's pretty easy because there are nests everywhere. And it's funny because as soon as the young start flying, they go land on any nest that they happen to be near. And Alan has a very funny picture of a female osprey on a perch over a nest, and there are 6 young in her nest. And of course, we love to put human thoughts into animals' minds, but I always talk about, like she's saying, what happened here? That's sort of like your teenage son's friend or daughter's friends all came over to raid the fridge.
And osprey, can have sometimes complicated, nesting habits. And again, it's hard to sort of like get into their minds and know what might be motivating to do something or not. But we had a question about the nest on Hog Island, where we do have a camera right now. And Carrie on Explore.org writes, hi, Dr. B, do you think it's possible that Steve and Callie, and those are the osprey that are on the nest on Hog Island, have another nest somewhere else where Callie is laying eggs? Perhaps the main nest on Hog Island has now become more of a hangout place.
Well, there's so are they on the boathouse? Because there's a boathouse right, quarter mile across the water, and if they were going to be anywhere, they'd be over there. And there are on Hog Island, there are other nests. There was at least one other osprey. There was one other osprey nest when I was up doing the Raptor Rapture camp there. So yeah, they could have a different nest and then be hanging out. That's possible. They could just hang out at the old nest. They had the story behind that nest is great horned owls discovered it, and for a number of years, the great horned owls took one or two or all of the young out of the nest. So that the adult ospreys there may be nesting at another spot and go use the old nest as just a spot to perch, and that's possible.
And the ospreys, they can live long lives, as we've mentioned, before. But they do face many threats during their lives. And I think maybe for the last few minutes of our broadcast, it could be worthwhile to talk about like their overall conservation. And to get us sort of in that mindset, Lisa on Facebook asked, "What is the main threat to ospreys?"
Humans are a significant threat, not in the States as much as they used to be. And in Europe, ospreys were shot a lot, and probably more decline of ospreys in Europe due to shooting than DDT, or certainly more. The shooting was much more of an important factor in the disappearance of ospreys from the United Kingdom, for instance. Ospreys run into fish farms down in Central and South America, and often don't come out of the other end of a fish farm. So humans can be a significant pressure on them, but more thinking more naturally, raccoons as predators on the young or eggs are very significant, and great horned owls are a significant predator on the young, and great horned owls will sometimes even kill adult ospreys, and bald eagles will also take young ospreys out of the nest. We saw that at Hog Island at least once. It's amazing that ospreys can nest at all in the presence of bald eagles, because every osprey nest is sitting out in the open, and it's like a little snack tray with young ospreys in it. So I'm surprised that more bald eagles don't take osprey. More osprey young aren't taken by bald eagles than we think of. And some of the people following these nest cams probably heard about, or maybe even saw footage of the bald eagles that wound up raising a red-tailed hawk, because the male snatched a young red-tailed hawk out of a nest and delivered it as prey to its nest, and it hadn't killed it. It just dropped it off there, and then Mama Eagle got back and saw this little midget eagle in her nest and raised the young red-tail. So my guess is that that's happened more than once with ospreys. I bet their ospreys have been raised by bald eagles in just those circumstances. And
we've been learning so much about these birds, through your work and the work of other biologists over the last several decades, and especially with the advances in miniaturization of like electronics, and that has allowed us to apply transmitters to a lot of these birds and follow them throughout much of their lives, if not their whole lives. And one of my last questions for the Q&A today comes from Explore.org, and Firefly98 was wondering, have we learned anything recently about ospreys that's been especially surprising?
That was a successful copulation there.
Okay.
Chesapeake Bay's just pulled it off, Burrs. So the nest cams have been an amazing source of information. I led the team that revised Cornell's. Cornell has a Birds of the World project where they have a very encyclopedic review of the biology and natural history of all the birds in the world, and I've done the I worked on the first Osprey account, and then we just revised the account of back in 2014, and I relied heavily on people who were watching, especially the Hog Island Osprey fanatics. I would ask them a question about, well, when do eggs hatch? And they were able to tell me, give me detailed accounts of when eggs had hatched and over a number of years, what food was being brought in. So there are probably 5 or 6 little tidbits about osprey biology and behavior that the Hog Island Osprey cam community knew very well that I didn't know about. A lot of people who watch Osprey cams have watched a lot more Osprey behavior than I have. And so these are, you Osprey cam followers can be citizen scientists. And I know there are some pride people are collecting, using cam watchers to collect data on what fish are being brought in, how often they're being brought in. So the cam community is a real resource, and we've learned a lot about osprey behavior. We didn't know how much the young ospreys will work on trimming the nests themselves. And that was something that we had never seen and didn't know about until we watched nests through cams like Explore.org has. And so we've learned a lot from these cameras.
Yeah, it's been really amazing for me to participate in this webcam community as well, because you can discover so much by watching these birds and filling out a lot of the gaps in our knowledge about their behavior, especially their nesting behavior, because we can watch them 24/7 through these webcams, when that was something that an individual person just can't do. But collectively, we can sort of use the hive mind of the community to find these really interesting details about their lives overall. Rob, I just have one more question for you before we conclude the broadcast today, or actually 2 more. The first one is, what is it? I'm curious to know from you, what is it about ospreys that you find most personally captivating?
There's several things. They're so easy to study because they're out in the open. If someone told you that they had a hard time finding an osprey nest, you'd tell them that they need a new profession. So they're easy to work with, and they're charismatic, dramatic. You get to watch so much of even before the days of cameras. It's so easy to watch them hunt. They're spectacular hunters, and then with all the work I did with satellite telemetry, they're learning about their migration. It was just fascinating. So there are lots of places that I often say that if Martha's Vineyard secedes from the nation, the osprey will be its national bird, and there are a lot of places like that. Ospreys are just so popular that they're big and charismatic, exciting, dramatic. They're just thrilling birds to work with and watch.
And my final question for you is, what can we do to help protect osprey?
Well, if you're out west, don't throw baling twine around, because that's a huge source of mortality in the west, in ranch and farm country. Providing nest platforms are obviously an important thing that we can do. Don't throw away discarding fishing line. That's the same thing as the baling twine. Ospreys tend to pick up tangles of baling twine or fishing line, thinking it's a bunch of eelgrass to line their nest, and young get all tangled in it and die. So that's be careful what you throw away if you're a rancher or if you're a fisher person. If you put up a pole, make sure that there's a predator guard on it so raccoons can't get up to it. And those are the things that we can do.
Well, Rob, thanks for your time today. It's been a really fun conversation, and I've learned a lot about ospreys and their lives. So thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure.
And my guest for this Q&A has been ornithologist and osprey researcher, Dr. Rob Bierregaard. If you want to learn more about his research, go check out his website. A lot of great information on there, pretty neat. It's ospreytrax.com. That's Osprey, TRAX.com. And I'd like to thank all of our partners who help us to provide these osprey cams, partners like Maine Audubon and the Owl Research Institute, Nine Pipes Lodge in Montana, and then also the Chesapeake Conservancy. And if you want to watch these birds at any time, just go to explore.org/osprey. Finally, our giveaway winners for today's Q&A, congratulations to Spring Anchorage on TikTok, Lisa Yen on Facebook, Owl and Osprey on explore.org, and Lighting the Fire on Reddit. Winners can claim their prize by sending us an email directly to feedback@explore.org. Tomorrow on Bird Week, it's Eagles and Falcons with John Howe and Amy Reese from the Raptor Resource Project. That's May 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. And my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening. It's been great to speak with you today, and enjoy Bird Week, and get outside hopefully as well and enjoy the birds in your neighborhood and community. Have a great day.